Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astel's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, we're taking another trip to a galaxy far, far away to see what the Jedi Code has to say about emotions and attachment. Let's begin. Well, welcome everybody. Wow, 20 episodes. This is incredible. I know I feel like I say this all the time, but I never expected that this would keep going. Certainly not that I would have as many listeners as I do. So I just want to say a very sincere thank you for listening, whether this is the first episode you've ever listened to, or if you're sticking with them, and this is your 20th episode. Thank you, and I hope to keep making episodes that you enjoy. This particular episode is going to be another episode of Star Wars and Spirituality. This is a series that we've done here and there. Back in episode 4, we looked at the Jedi and monks to see what comparisons there were. We also talked about overlap between the Force and the Holy Spirit. And then in episode 9, we looked at the fall of Anakin and the fall of Eve to see what Revenge of the Sith could tell us about sin. So, I decided to make this episode because Star Wars has been on my mind a lot lately. There are 2 books that I'm in the middle of right now. One of them I'm rereading. It is called How Star Wars Conquered the Universe. It's a, I don't know if a history book is the right word, but it presents the history of the Star Wars saga all the way back from talking about some of those science fiction and fantasy classics that would then go on to inspire George Lucas. So, phenomenal. And I'm also reading the novel Master and Apprentice, which features Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and it takes place a little bit before Phantom Menace. So that's actually the first novel that I've read that's part of the current canon. I read a lot of novels back in the day that are now legends, but this is the first novel I've read that's still canonical, and I'm really enjoying it so far. That said, I still haven't seen Book of Boba Fett. I've started episode 1. I haven't had time to finish it, but I do want to give a shout out to one of my students who makes sure to check in every day or every couple days to see whether I've started it yet, because he's desperate to talk about it, and it's getting harder and harder for him not to give spoilers. So, to that student, I think you know who you are, but shout out. Anyway, just like in previous episodes of Star Wars and Spirituality, what I want to do is take something from Star Wars and hold it up next to our Catholic faith and see what we notice. So this time, we're going to look at the Jedi Code, and specifically the Jedi, the way that the Jedi approach emotions and attachment. And this is especially relevant for any of my students who are taking the church, because right now we're in a unit on interreligious dialogue, and we're going to be looking at Jediism, which is a real-world religion based on the Jedi Code. Now, disclaimer, as always, I feel like I need to give a disclaimer about my Star Wars knowledge, or lack thereof, because like I mentioned a second ago, most of my exposure to what was then called the expanded universe is no longer canon. And so when it comes to the material that is currently canonical, my exposure is really limited to the movies. A few things here and there outside the movies, like The Mandalorian, but mostly I'm drawing from the movies. And then, as I mentioned, that novel that I'm in the middle of. So the other thing that I want to give a disclaimer about today is that there are 2 difficulties that will come up when we try to talk about Jedi philosophy. The first one is that, at least as it's presented in the canon, Jedi philosophy isn't a super well-developed philosophical system. You get little bits and pieces thrown out here and there, but there's no Jedi philosophy book, right? And so it's not always clear how certain terms are used. Even basic terms like passion or attachment. What you'll find is that different parts of the canon seem to address them in different ways. And so what we're going to try to do is synthesize what the most common threads are, what the most common themes are, what's a coherent way we could look at this. And yeah, sometimes there are almost contradictions in the way that different parts of the canon address these things. So I've done my best, but I'm going to just put a qualifier here at the start. Anything I say about Jedi philosophy comes with a big if, meaning if this is how Jedi philosophy is meant to be understood, then this is what we would say. Of course, if I'm entirely wrong and I've missed the mark and this is not at all what Jedi philosophy is all about, then a lot of this will kind of be wasted time. But I think I at least picked up some of the main themes. And just a reminder before we dive in, if you have any ideas for future episodes, including future episodes of the Star Wars and Spirituality series, you can submit those ideas at bonuspointspodcast.com. Just head to the page called Suggest a Topic. I'm always looking for new ideas for future episodes. All right, without further ado, let's talk about the Jedi Code. So even if you've never seen Star Wars, you probably know what Jedi are, especially if you went back and listened to episode 4, our Jedi monks. So the Jedi Code refers to the set of rules that governs their behavior. It actually was first mentioned in an early draft of episode 5, Empire Strikes Back, when Luke took what was called the Jedi Oath before he left Yoda on Dagobah to go to Cloud City. That didn't make it into the final cut, though. The first time it's mentioned in the canon, in something that became, in a released form anyway, was in Phantom Menace. We hear a reference to the Jedi Code. And so the most famous part of the code is called the mantra of the Jedi Code. And this is so well known compared to the rest of the code that for many people, this is the Jedi Code, and they didn't even realize there was more. And of course, part of that is we never get the entire Jedi Code in one place. So it's referenced here and there. You know that it's the set of rules. But really, here's the part that most people think of when they think of the Jedi Code. So the mantra is a series of statements. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. So, a couple times in there, this concept of emotion or passion comes up. So let's start with, what do the Jedi seem to believe about emotions? Well, the first line implies that emotion and peace are not compatible, or at least that peace completes our emotions. That peace is this thing beyond emotion. Jedi seem to believe that in one sense, they should trust their emotions more than their reason. We hear people say things like, search your feelings or trust your feelings, even from episode 4, right from the start. In another sense, strong emotions are to be distrusted. There's something that will cloud your judgment, that you need to be aware of your emotions because they will affect your decision making. And at first, this seems to be a contradiction. On the one hand, they're saying, trust your feelings, to make decisions based on instinct above reason. And at the same time, they're saying that emotions cloud judgment. So how can is it possible to synthesize these ideas, or are they just necessarily contradictions? I think that if you wanted to, you could synthesize these by saying that emotion and instinct are related but not identical. So it's fine for the Jedi to say, don't trust your emotions, don't trust your strong emotions, and also make decisions on instinct. If you differentiate between instinct and emotion, that those aren't the same thing. And you could also make the point that they might say that strong emotions will cloud your judgment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be emotionless, that we can't trust any emotion, just that we need to recognize once they get to a certain intensity, they're going to affect our decision making. So I don't know if this is how a Jedi would synthesize these two ideas, but it seems to work for me, so we're going to go with it. One other thing about emotion that we seem to get this idea that emotion and passion are different, though it's not really explained how, at least not in the mantra, not in what I just read, and not in anything else I've read. So I'm not sure if those two terms are used differently, what exactly the difference is. So that's kind of the basics. What do Jedi claim about emotions? What would we answer that as Catholics? Well, the first thing we have to say about emotions as Catholics is that they are good, that they're part of what it means to be human. They're part of who we are. God gave us these emotions. We even say that the will, which would include emotions, desires, that is one of the faculties of the soul. That's an important part of being human. We also believe that emotions are received, which is why we also call them passions, from passive. And so expressing or feeling an emotion in and of itself is never a sin because we can't really control what we're feeling. The question is how we respond to it. And so that's why we hear things like be angry but without sin. So we feel emotions, even negative emotions, and we can't always control that. But what we can do is decide how we're going to act, on those emotions or not, as the case may be. So let's go point by point through what we just said the Jedi believe about emotions and see how we would respond. So first of all, we would counter that emotions and peace are not incompatible. So we would not say something like there is no emotion, there is peace. Because peace, this fruit of the Spirit, is a very positive thing, and it can develop regardless of our emotions. And so we can have a very negative emotion. We can be devastated. We can be not despondent, but because that would imply a lack of hope. But we can be in a situation where we're feeling some very strong negative emotions and yet still have peace, because peace ultimately relies not on our emotional state, but on our dependence on the Lord. And so if we have that dependence on God, we will have peace, no matter what our hearts are feeling. We'll have that trust in God. So one thing that we can point out about the Jedi approach that is good is that it recognizes the role of instinct. That's a thing. We have instincts, right? We have these movements that seem to go beyond our conscious reason, our conscious thought, and that could be part of our subconscious. It could also be our conscience, spelled slightly differently. It could be that movement that tries to point out what is good. It could be the Holy Spirit. It could be our guardian angels. And so we have this experience of feel like our gut tells us something, and we have an instinct about something. And we would say, yeah, absolutely. That's certainly a thing, whether it has a natural origin in the subconscious or a supernatural origin in the Holy Spirit. We are sometimes moved by instinct. Now, this is where we might push back a little bit against what the Jedi claim. We would not say that those instincts are superior to reason. There's a fine line between trusting our instincts and making decisions based on emotion. And that's kind of one of the things original sin does. It flips us around a little bit to the point where we make decisions based on emotion and then we try to justify it with our reason, when it should be the other way around, right? Our emotions should kind of point us in a direction, but then it's our reason that should decide what to do. We shouldn't be using our reason just to justify something after the fact. So we would recognize that instinct is good, instinct is important, but it's not superior to reason. And in fact, there shouldn't be a contradiction between the two. Our instincts shouldn't lead us to do something irrational, even if it's something that we can't properly explain why we think we should do this thing. It should never be something that goes contrary to reason. That's not a good instinct. Here's the other thing that we might want to, again, give a little pushback against the Jedi. We get this impression that strong emotions are bad, that emotions are fine. Again, no one's saying that the Jedi have to be totally emotionless robots, unless they're robot like droids that are Jedi. But we do get the sense that strong emotions disturb, that the stronger your emotions are, the more your judgment's going to be clouded, and the harder it will be for you to sense the Force. And so Jedi are supposed to be kind of serene, right? They're not supposed to feel any emotion, good or bad, too strongly, because that would disrupt them. That would take them out of that that centered state where they're in a state of tranquility. We would disagree with that. We would say there's nothing wrong with feeling emotions strongly. And in fact, we're all going to have times when we feel certain emotions stronger than at other times, right? And Jesus himself experienced this. We see, especially when his friend Lazarus dies, we hear expressions like Jesus became greatly perturbed or greatly disturbed. We see Jesus weeping. He shudders before he goes into the tomb. So Jesus himself felt strong emotions. He didn't just feel emotions in kind of a detached, serene way, but he entered into our human experience. And that means that sometimes he had very, very powerful emotions, good and bad. And so we shouldn't be afraid of feeling strongly. We are also called to have a good depth of self-knowledge. St. Catherine of Siena said that you can't know God unless you know yourself. I'm paraphrasing there. But the more we know ourselves, the more we understand kind of how we work, the more we're going to understand what we're feeling and why we're feeling it and how that's going to affect us. What is today often called like emotional intelligence, that's an important part of growing in prayer, is being able to not only name your feelings, but identify the sources of them and identify what effects they're having on your behavior. And this, of course, requires us to find that healthy balance. We're not denying that we have emotions. We're not saying that they don't exist. We're also not going to make decisions entirely based on them. We want to take a very honest, very open look at what we're feeling and how it's affecting us. Last thing I want to mention here about emotion before we get into attachment is something called effective prayer. And that's effective spelled with an A, not with an E. We're not saying like effective prayer, like you'll definitely get what you want. No, this is effective prayer with an A, because it's based on affections. And so this is defined by Father Jordan Aumann. He's a Dominican who wrote a book on spiritual theology that I have linked below, or linked in the show notes rather. He defines it as a type of prayer in which the operations of the will predominate over discursus of the intellect. And you might be saying, that's meaningless to me. You should feel bad. Basically what that's saying, the operations of the will, which we might say would include feelings or emotions, are going to predominate over the discursus of the intellect, or what he called meditation. So we in prayer, we have this idea that we want to think, right? We want to apply our mind to something of the faith so that our love for God is increased. Effective prayer is what happens when we make that switch, where we've been meditating on something, either a passage from the gospel or a virtue or something like that. And we have that moment where our thinking about that part of the faith has stirred us to emotion, has stirred us to love of God. And that's kind of when we move into effective prayer. And so far from denying our emotions, we ultimately want to have strong emotions, especially of love and peace and joy for the Lord. Now, all of that said, I feel like I need to give a little bit of a disclaimer there. This does not mean that we should try to force emotions in prayer, that our prayer time is sitting there trying to work ourselves up into some sort of emotional frenzy. He even goes on to say, neither should we force the affections when they do not come forth spontaneously or when they have run their course. We should return to discursive or vocal prayer and not try to prolong the affection by our own efforts. In other words, we receive these emotions, we give these emotions of love to the Lord, but we shouldn't sit there and try to just, like, by our own effort, try to force ourselves to feel something. And part of that is because prayer is more than emotions. We can't judge the quality of our prayer by the emotional response. And so effective prayer is good. It is when we are inspired to feel a strong love for God in prayer. But that's not the goal. That's not the goal is to love, not necessarily to experience any particular emotion. So there we go. How can we sum all this up? Well, generally, I would say we have a more positive view of emotions than Jedi. Emotions, even strong ones, are an important part of being human, and they can help us grow closer to God. At the same time, we agree with the Jedi that emotions can cloud judgment and make it harder to make decisions. All right, what about attachment? This is kind of the other, emotions and attachment, that's kind of the other big thing that comes up. Just like with emotion, this one has a healthy mix of yes, we agree, and no, we don't. So overall, the Jedi have a very Buddhist understanding of attachment. And this was intentional. George Lucas is very open about this. In a 1999 Time magazine interview, he even described himself as a Buddhist Methodist or a Methodist Buddhist. And he said, yeah, I'm very intentional. That's kind of how I pictured the Jedi. And so if we have a good understanding of how Buddhism, or what Buddhism says about attachment, that will give us some clues about the Jedi. And the first thing we should say here is that attachment is not the same as affection, fondness, or closeness. This is a common misconception, even both in the canon and behind the scenes, where people will say that the Jedi can't have friendships or they can't have affection for others because that would be attachment. Not necessarily. Those are two separate things. What makes it attachment is that attachment leads to fear of loss. And that fear of loss is going to lead to greed, which is going to lead to anger, which leads to hate, which leads to suffering. And that the path to the dark side is. And this is basically the second noble truth of Buddhism. So in Buddhism, you have the Four Noble Truths. And the second one is that attachment leads to suffering. That's basically what the Jedi say, just with a few extra steps. So what would we say about all this from a Catholic perspective? Well, we can actually support most of that, right? If we have attachment to created things, if we're attached to created things, that's going to keep us from God, right? If we've already filled our cup with created things, there's not going to be enough room for God. And so there is this process of detachment and of pouring out in order to make room for God. So we wouldn't say that attachment is the source of all suffering, but we still need to work on detaching ourselves from created things. This is why we fast. This is why we give things up for Lent. St. John of the Cross uses the image of a bird that has something tied around its leg. It doesn't matter if what's tied around its leg is a strong chain or a slender thread. Until it's broken, that bird can't fly, right? And so he compares that, he uses that as an image for us. Okay, we get away from mortal sins. Fantastic, important, necessary first step. But if we're still holding on to maybe imperfections or venial sins, or we just have attachments to the world, we're never going to grow in union with God, right? It doesn't matter how thick the thread is. Until it's broken, we're stuck on earth. So like the Jedi, we would say that we need to be detached from created things. Here's the key difference. When we say that as Christians we need to practice detachment, it's always for the sake of something else. We detach ourselves from created things so that we can be attached to God. We empty ourselves to be filled by Him. Whereas with the Jedi and in Buddhism, the emptiness itself is the end. That is the objective. Detachment is sought sort of for its own sake. And so we would be with them up to a point where we say that attachment causes problems. But the objective is totally different. We are not seeking detachment for its own sake. We're not rejecting things because they're bad or even just rejecting them for the sake of rejecting them. We always have that positive objective of union with God. So we fast so that we can feast. We fast, we give up created things so that we can be filled with the uncreated, to be filled with God. Another difference that we could argue is that when we're detached as Christians, that actually causes us to love created things even more deeply or in an even deeper way. So think about it this way. If I'm attached to something, if I have that attachment to something created, whether it's a person or food or an object or whatever it is, my love for that person, place, or thing is always going to be selfish, at least in a little bit, because I'm going to be focused on what I get out of it. Whereas if I detach myself from created things, if I'm filled with God's love, I'm going to love with His love. That means that my love for everything and everyone is going to be deeper and purer than any sort of love I could muster on my own, because I'm no longer loving something for what I get out of it. I'm loving it with God's love. And so detachment should not make us cold or emotionless. Far from it. It actually makes us love even more than we ever could on our own. It makes us love others gratuitously. More than I was going to say more than is owed to them, but God himself tells us we owe this to others. So what I'll say is it makes us love others for their own sake, right? And so we detach ourselves from created things, and paradoxically, that makes us love those created things in an even better way. So to sum it all up, when we look at the Jedi approach to emotions and attachment, we see that it is very strongly inspired by Buddhism. And so there are some things there that we would agree with. As Nostra Aetate, Vatican II's document on other religions would say, there are rays of truth here. Even if we're not going to agree totally, even if we're not going to say we have an approach to emotions and attachment that totally squares with what Jedi teach, there's still some overlap there. And that's really what this series is all about. What connections can we find? So, what resources do I have for you this time? I'm going to have a link in the show notes to both of the books I mentioned at the top of the episode. That's How Star Wars Conquered the Universe and Master and Apprentice. I'm also going to be linking to a Wikipedia article on the Jedi Code. As always, Wikipedia is one of my most consulted sources for anytime I record one of these episodes. I'm also going to be linking to a transcript of the 1999 Time Magazine interview that they did with George Lucas. I'm going to have a link to John chapter 11, which is where we find the death of Lazarus and we can see Jesus experiencing some strong emotions. And that book that I referenced by Jordan Aumann called Spiritual Theology. Check out chapter 7, where he talks about attachment and detachment as a necessary part of growth in interior life. And check out chapter 12 for his description of effective prayer. Lastly, I'm going to be linking to St. John of the Cross's book, Ascent of Mount Carmel, where you will find that analogy with the bird in book 1, chapter 11. As always, I want to encourage you to check out the website, bonuspointspodcast.com. There you'll find the show notes. You'll find a place to ask questions for future episodes of Question and Astle. You'll find a place to submit topics and all sorts of good stuff. And as always, I would encourage you to share this with somebody you think would like it, whether it's this episode or the show as a whole. I'm always wild. Is that a word? Wild? Odd? I'm always humbled more than anything when I get feedback from listeners, just saying how much the show has impacted them. Like I've said so many times, I started this because my class asked me to, and I have fun with it. So I keep doing it because I enjoy it. But it is just, man, glory to God that there are people who are learning lots and even coming to a deeper connection with their faith because of this. So that's going to do it for this episode of Bonus Points. Thank you for joining us as we continue every episode to put out into the deep, exploring the world of theology, that galaxy far, far away, and beyond.